Hi, today we're going to work on hems. There's many different types of hems that you can put in a garment, and you'll have to consider things like the weight of the fabric, what type of garment is it, what's going to be the best hem for your garment. In this class, we're only going to work on two different types of hems. One will be a machine sewn hem, and the other one will be a hand sewn hem. There's a variety of different ways that you can complete a hem, and in your textbook you will find other types of hems if you want to explore hems. But the first one I'm going to do is what's called a double turned hem or a clean edge hem, and most of the times you will find those at the bottom of a pair of blue jeans where the denim has been folded twice and then top stitched with like the gold thread. Or you'll see it at the bottom of a button-down shirt, and those would be the most common places that you would see that type of hem. So to complete the hems today, you're going to need two pieces of fabrics that are the 4x9. So here's my piece of fabric, and you're going to need this ruler. This is a nice ruler because it's marked in increments of an inch, or and in between that inch, marked at 1/8 of an inch. So what we're going to be doing today is what's called a 1/2 inch double turned hem. So what you're going to do is you're going to turn up your fabric, and I'm going to angle this camera so you can see what I'm doing. You're going to turn the fabric up from the wrong side of the fabric 1 inch. So you can take this little ruler and you can set it to help you with a 1 inch turn, and you want to lay your fabric down and you're going to turn the fabric up 1 inch. And for the sake of just doing a sample, you can pin it like at both ends and then we'll press it. If you were doing an entire hem all the way around a garment, you would maybe about every 6 or 8 inches you would put another pin to control that dimension. It's really important that you maintain a nice even dimension so that the bottom, whatever you're hemming, has a nice even straight hem. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go to the iron and we're going to press this, and then we're going to turn it under a 1/2 inch, and then we'll go to the sewing machine and we'll sew that 1/2 inch. So here we are at the ironing board, and I have my sample turned up 1 inch. I hope that you can see this okay. And I'm just going to press that nice and flat with the iron. Most of the time when you hit the area where you have the pins, you want to take them out because you don't want to scratch the sole plate here on the iron. I'm going to give it a little burst of steam. And then we want to let it cool off. Be careful when you touch your ironing board after you've just steamed because it will be hot. And I'm going to turn this under a 1/2 inch. So basically I'm turning that edge under, and I'm going to press it and go all the way across. If you were doing a much bigger hem, you would probably want to fold it and pin it and then press it. So now we've got this nice 1/2 inch fold, and we're going to be ready to machine stitch that hem. I'm going to go ahead right now and I'm going to press up 1 inch on my other sample so that I'm prepared to be able to sew the hand sewn seam. So here we are at the sewing machine, and I've got my sample ready to do a clean finish on the sewing machine. One of the things that sometimes you want to adjust is your stitch length. We don't want to have stitches that are super close together that don't look very attractive. So on my sewing machine, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to adjust my stitch length to a number 3 so that it's a little bit longer than that 2.2. And you always want to have the bulk of your fabric off to your left. If you have too much fabric kind of squished into this area, it's going to be awkward to sew. And so I'm going to line up my fabric so that my needle is going to hit, and I'm not sure if you can really see this that well. You want your needle to hit somewhere in the area close to the edge, not too far down on the seam. You want it to be close to the edge, but not go off into the area that doesn't have the seam turned up. So because this is a permanent hem, you're not going to be removing it. That's not temporary. You're going to back stitch at that very beginning. So make sure that these threads are out the back of your machine so that you don't have it ball up on the surface. And I'm going to go forward a couple of stitches, 1, 2, or 3 maybe, and then I'm going to back stitch. So however button you have on a machine to back stitch, or if it's a lever over here, do your back stitch a couple of stitches. And then go forward and sew your seam. And so work to, right now, try to make sure that you maintain an even dimension. This is a good time as we're making our seams to practice and make sure that we're able to control where the needle's hitting the fabric. Are we getting the results that we want? And then when I get to the end, again, I'm going to back stitch. So that's simply that little 1/2 inch double turn hem that you'll see on a shirt and blue jeans. And let me hold it up here for you so you can see that the stitching is fairly close to the edge of the fabric. It's nice and neat. When you flip it over, you've got a nice straight line on the surface. Now, normally you wouldn't use black thread, but for the sake of being able to see it in the video and for me to be able to see your samples, a contrasting thread might be a good idea. So that's your double turned hem. The next hem that we're going to create is what's called a hand sewn hem. It's referred to as a slip stitch or blind stitch. You will find diagrams of this hem in your textbook on page 104. And what you're going to need is the other sample that you folded up 1 inch and we have it pinned in place, and a spool of thread, and a hand sewing needle. I like to use the smallest needle that will make smaller holes in the fabric. Starting out, you might want to use a larger needle till you get used to what you're sewing. And so you're going to cut off a piece of thread and thread your needle. No matter how long your hem is, you're never going to use a super long piece of thread. Because as the thread is passing through the fabric, there's an abrasion taking place, and the longer the piece of thread, the more the thread is going to be kind of worn out when you get to the end. So you really don't want to have a piece of thread that's more than 18 or 24 inches long, and then you'll just keep adding another piece of thread and continuing on as needed. In order to get your thread through the needle, you really want to cut the thread with a nice sharp pair of scissors, because if your thread is fuzzy on the end, it's not going to want to pass through the eye of a needle. So when we're thinking about language of sewing, and this needle is called a sharp. There's a bunch of different kinds of needles, like in between quilting needles. This is a sharp. That information was all in those first couple of chapters. You want to take your thread and you want to pass the thread through the eye of the needle. So that hole in the needle is called the eye of the needle. You can get a little tool that has a wire that you can pass through the needle and pull the thread through. Most of the time I'm pretty good at threading a needle. For some reason this one doesn't seem to want to pass through. So there we go. The thread is in the needle. Now for a hem, you don't need to have 2 pieces of thread. It's not doubled. So you're going to just let the one end hang down. And as you're sewing, you're really going to hang on to the thread so your needle doesn't come unthreaded. And we need to put a knot at the end. I have a particular method of wrapping the thread around the needle and pulling the needle through the thread. That's very difficult for me to teach that in a video. It has to do with holding the thread in a circle, wrapping it around the needle, and pulling it through. Some people wrap the thread around their finger and then kind of roll it off and pull back. My granny was really good at this, but that's not my thing. So I'm wrapping it. Let's try to see if we can make a knot. Nope, that doesn't work for me very well. Well, I do have a knot, so that's good enough. The knot's just going to help the thread from not coming out of your stitching as you're stitching. And so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to push this film camera down so you can actually see what I'm stitching and try to get this centered for you. And the first thing that you're going to do, I'm right-handed, so I'm always in this type of stitching situation, I'm stitching from right to left. If you're left-handed, you're going to have to go in the other direction. And you're first going to just pick up a few threads in your fabric, and you're trying to make sure that you don't grab a lot of the thread or really pass through and on the outside of the fabric see a big piece of thread. So I'm just grabbing a couple of threads that are they look like they're in the warp direction, and I'm going to pick up that and anchor my thread. Sometimes, depending on the fabric, if it's like when you're working with heavier wools, it's a good idea to do it twice. And so now my thread is very secure inside the fabric. And so the next thing you do is you're just going to take a small stitch in the hem edge diagonally. So I'm taking my needle and I'm going through the fabric at an angle, and then I'm going to come back over and I'm going to take another small stitch in the outer fabric. So you're not going through both layers, you're going from the hem layer to the garment layer and back to the hem layer, and you're just going to go across, going back and forth. So you almost look like you have a bit of a zigzaggy sort of thing taking place. So again, back up to the fabric, grab a couple of stitches, come back down to your hem piece and stitch through that. I'm making it a little bit on the large side so that you can actually see. And what you'll wind up with is just these little lines that are on the surface of the fabric. If you didn't want to see on the surface of the inside, you would fold this down and then you would do a stitch. Let me go through here. So I would do a stitch in the garment, a stitch in my folded back piece of the hem. And you're going to do your stitching about a 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch apart. You don't want to make really super large stitches because then your hem can catch on something when you're getting dressed and what have you and pull out, but you don't want it really tight and small because you're going to see that on the surface. And so I would say, maybe your stitches are about less than 1/2 inch apart, more like about 3/8. So again, you just go into your garment and grab a couple of little yarns in that weave, come back to your hem and you can go under, and you just keep going back and forth. So you're going to see sort of a zigzaggy effect in that fabric. And, afterwards, it's a good idea to sort of press your fabric so that you set the threads. You want to be careful not to have the thread kind of getting twisted up and caught. One of the things that we can use is something called Thread Heaven or beeswax. If you've purchased that, it's a good idea to have put that on the thread before you start. Unfortunately, here we go, here's the beeswax. So you would have just pulled your thread through the beeswax like this, and it coats the thread and keeps it from twisting back on itself. Hand sewing is going to be something that takes a little bit of getting used to. I wouldn't expect that right out of the chute that you're going to sew your first sample and it's going to be like excellent and perfect. It's going to take practice. But, if you learn how to do hems, that's something that you can do for other people and charge them to shorten their pants. the double turn hem is a good hem to use on blue jeans. So if someone needs their blue jeans shortened, you're going to be able to shorten their jeans. And so here I've just made a series of stitches. You can see they're on the surface here. These were the ones that I buried underneath. I don't like to see my stitching. This is not a hem that I hardly ever use on anything because I don't like how it looks, but it's a good basic hem to start with. And if you look at the other side of the fabric, you can see that you see a tiny little bit of the thread that came through. It's called a pick mark. That's why you would want to use a matching thread so that you don't see that on the surface. And you want to be really careful that when you're stitching, you don't over pull this, because then what happens is you're going to get a ripply, wrinkly hem. It's not going to look good on the surface. So we want to make sure that we don't pull our thread too tight. So go ahead and make that sample and sew all the way across. When you get to the other end, you want to tie the thread off. So here I'm going to do this. I'm going into my hem. Hopefully turning it this way might be a little more helpful for you. So into the fabric, into the hem, and over and over. And when you get to the end, what I usually do is I take a sort of like foundation stitch, and I'll do it a second time to make sure that it's not going to come apart. And I take, now that I have a loop, I go above the loop and then under it, sometimes twice. And when I pull that, it makes a nice secure knot that the thread is not going to come out of your hem later on. So if you've run out of thread at this point, you get a new piece of thread, you put a knot in it, and go over one length of your stitch and start there and continue your hem. So good luck on making hems.